Sarah Mitchell stood before the towering iron gates of the Morrison estate, her heart pounding with anxiety. As a struggling single mother, she needed this job desperately. But what she didn't know was that behind these gates lay a dark secret. Would this be her chance for a better life or a dangerous trap? Welcome to Soulful Stories 86, where we pause, reflect, and explore deeply moving stories together. Let's step into today's journey. Sarah Mitchell tightened her grip on her worn leather purse as she stood before the massive iron gates of the Morrison estate. The early morning sun cast long shadows over the pristine driveway, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her chest. She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. This was her last chance. At 32, Sarah was a single mother struggling to provide for her 7-year-old daughter, Emma. Life had never been easy, but lately, it had become unbearable. Overdue rent notices, medical bills piling up, and the gnawing fear that she wouldn't be able to keep a roof over their heads. She needed this job more than anything. The sharp click of heels on stone pulled her from her thoughts. A stern-faced woman in a tailored suit approached, unlocking the gate with swift efficiency. "Miss Mitchell." The woman's voice was crisp and professional. "Yes, that's me," Sarah replied, her voice barely steady. "In Victoria Hayes, head of household staff. Follow me." Sarah fell into step behind her, trying to suppress the growing anxiety in her chest. The mansion before her was enormous, tall glass windows gleaming under the sunlight, intricate stonework carved into the walls. It was the kind of house Sarah had only ever seen in magazines, a world so far removed from her reality that it felt almost surreal. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and expensive cologne. Marble floors stretched endlessly, reflecting the grandeur of crystal chandeliers and priceless artwork that adorned the walls. She didn't belong here. "The position is to care for Mr. Alexander Morrison," Victoria explained, leading Sarah down a long hallway. "He suffered a severe accident 6 months ago and has been in a vegetative state since." Sarah swallowed hard. She'd read about Alexander Morrison, a billionaire CEO, a tech genius, a man who had built an empire from nothing. But now, he was just a shell of the powerful figure the world once knew. Victoria continued, her tone clipped and matter-of-fact. "We've gone through 5 caretakers already. None lasted more than a few weeks." Sarah's steps faltered. "Why?" Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. They found the situation difficult. Difficult. That was an understatement. If 5 trained professionals had quit, what made them think she could handle it? They stopped in front of massive double doors. Victoria turned to face her, her expression unreadable. "The salary is 800,000 per month, with room and board included. You will work 6 days a week, with Sundays off to visit your daughter." Sarah's breath caught. $8,000. That was more money than she had ever dreamed of making. She could finally move Emma out of their tiny apartment, pay off their debts, give her daughter the life she deserved. Victoria studied her, waiting. "I accept," Sarah said, her voice firm. Victoria nodded and pushed open the doors. The room was bathed in soft natural light, filtering in through tall windows that overlooked an expansive garden. The air hummed with the quiet beeping of medical machines, and in the center of it all lay Alexander Morrison. Sarah's heart clenched at the sight. The man before her looked nothing like the powerful executive she had seen in news articles. His once strong frame was diminished, his cheekbones sharper than they should have been. His dark hair had grown out slightly, curling at the edges. Yet, even in this fragile state, there was something undeniably striking about him. The sharp lines of his jaw, the way his hands rested motionless against the sheets, as if he could wake up at any moment. Sarah stepped closer, swallowing the lump in her throat. "What exactly does this job require?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Monitoring his vital signs, administering medication, assisting with physical therapy, and ensuring his general comfort." Victoria listed, "Dr. Roberts visits twice a week to check on his condition. The night nurse will brief you on his care routine." Sarah nodded, absorbing the information. It was a big responsibility, but she had no choice. As Victoria spoke, Sarah's eyes were drawn to Alexander's face. There was something unsettling about seeing such a brilliant mind trapped in silence. What had really happened to him? That evening, after finishing her orientation, Sarah sat beside Alexander's bed, flipping through his medical records. His accident report was oddly vague, a head injury from an unspecified incident. She frowned. Why so little detail? Sarah glanced at Alexander's still form. What happened to you? She murmured. Of course. There was no answer, just the steady beep of the machines. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. This was just her mind playing tricks on her. The silence of the estate, the eerie stillness, it was getting to her already. Sarah shook off the unease and prepared for bed in her adjacent quarters. Before turning in, she called Emma. Hi, sweetheart, she said, forcing a smile into her voice. Mommy. Emma's voice was bright, full of love. Did you get the job? I did. Baby. And guess what? Soon, we'll have enough money to move into a bigger apartment. You'll finally have your own room. Emma gasped. Really? Can I paint it purple? Sarah laughed, her heart warming. Any color you want. After saying goodnight, she returned to check on Alexander one last time. The moonlight streamed through the windows, casting soft shadows across his face. She adjusted his blanket, and as she did, her hand brushed against his. His fingers twitched. Sarah froze. It was so faint she almost thought she imagined it, but as she pulled back, her breath caught in her throat. A whisper, barely audible, slipped through the quiet hum of the machines. Help me. Her stomach dropped. Sarah spun around, heart pounding, but Alexander remained completely still, his chest rising and falling in steady, unconscious rhythm. The machines showed no change, no sign of movement. Had she imagined it? Her pulse roared in her ears as she slowly backed toward the door. Something was wrong. Why had the other caretakers really left? And more importantly, what had really happened to Alexander Morrison? Sarah Mitchell adjusted the thin blanket covering Alexander Morrison, her fingers lingering on his hand. It was cold, lifeless, but something gnawed at her, the lingering feeling that she wasn't alone in the room. It had been 3 nights since she started working at the Morrison estate, and each night, something strange happened. The first night, she swore she saw his fingers twitch. The second night, she heard a faint whisper, so faint. She thought she imagined it. But last night was different. She had been reading to him, just as she did every evening. It had become a habit. Something about the silence of his room made her feel the need to fill it with words. With stories about Emma, her 7-year-old daughter who dreamed of painting her room purple and having a backyard with a swing set. And when she saw the ocean for the first time, Sarah had murmured, turning the page of the children's book. She laughed so hard, she fell into the water. Emma said it was the best day of her life. That's when it happened. The heart monitor beside her let out a single, sharp beep. Just one, but enough to make her look up. Eyes darting to Alexander's face. His expression remained still, eyes closed, breath steady. But something about the air in the room changed. It felt charged, as if an unspoken conversation was happening between them. Now, standing over him again, Sarah made a decision. Mr. Morrison, she whispered, leaning in close. I don't know if you can hear me, but if you can, I need you to show me. Silence, she sighed. Stepping back, maybe she was just imagining things. Then, tap, tap, tap. Her heart stopped. Sarah's gaze snapped to Alexander's hand. His fingers barely moved, but they were tapping against the mattress. A pattern. Her pulse quickened. He was trying to say something. Is that Morse code? She whispered, barely believing what she was seeing. She scrambled for her phone, opening a Morse code translator. Slowly, she deciphered the taps. SOS. Her breath caught in her throat. He wasn't just alive. He was trapped. The next morning, Sarah hurried into Alexander's room, gripping a notebook and pen. Good morning, Mr. Morrison, she greeted, keeping her voice steady for the cameras she now knew were watching. I thought today I'd read something different. She flipped open the notebook and, out of sight from the security cameras, scribbled a question. Who did this to you? She placed the pen in his hand, watching his fingers slowly curl around it. It was barely a grip, but enough to scratch out shaky letters. V. The pen wobbled. Slipping from his grip, Sarah picked it up, heart racing. VIC. She froze. Victoria. The head of household staff. The woman who had hired her. The woman who controlled who came in and out of this house. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. Sarah barely had time to rip out the page and stuff it into her pocket before the door swung open. Victoria stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "Miss Mitchell," she said smoothly, stepping inside. "I hope you're settling in well." Sarah forced a smile. "Yes, of course." Victoria's gaze lingered on her for a moment too long before she turned to Alexander. "His condition hasn't changed, has it?" Sarah hesitated. "No, he's the same." Victoria nodded, but something about her expression made Sarah uneasy, as if she knew something Sarah didn't. "Good," she said, turning toward the door. "Keep it that way." The warning was clear. That night, Sarah knew she had to search for answers. When she was certain the security staff had settled into their usual evening routine, she made her way toward Alexander's bedside table. Carefully, she pulled open the drawer, sifting through neatly arranged medical supplies until her fingers brushed against something different. A book. She pulled it out, realizing it was a leather-bound journal. Alexander's. Flipping through the pages, she found months of notes, financial dealings, business plans, until one page made her blood run cold. "If anything happens to me, the truth is in the code. Remember the garden." Sarah's hands trembled as she closed the book. What truth? What code? And why the garden? She barely had time to process before a voice startled her. "You shouldn't be snooping where you don't belong." "Miss Mitchell." Sarah spun around to find Dr. Roberts, Alexander's physician, standing in the doorway. Her heart pounded. How much had he seen? "You're hiding something," she said carefully. "Aren't you?" Dr. Roberts hesitated before stepping into the room. He glanced at Alexander, then back at Sarah. "There are things about this house you don't understand," he said quietly. "And if you're smart, you'll stop asking questions." Sarah clenched her fists. "What happened to him?" The doctor sighed, rubbing his temples. "The official report says it was an accident," he murmured. "But the toxicology report says otherwise." Sarah's breath hitched. "You mean he was poisoned?" Dr. Roberts hesitated, then nodded. "Something was in his system, something that wasn't supposed to be there. And every time we try to reduce his medication, someone makes sure it gets increased again." Sarah's stomach twisted. Someone was keeping him in this state on purpose. Before she could ask another question, Victoria's voice rang out from the hallway. "Dr. Roberts." He stiffened. "Forget we spoke," he muttered before disappearing into the corridor. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched the journal to her chest. Alexander was trying to wake up. Someone was trying to keep him under, and Sarah had just painted a target on her back. She glanced toward the window, where the garden stretched out under the moonlight. Remember the garden. Whatever Alexander had hidden, she was going to find it, even if it meant putting her own life on the line. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the message on her phone. "Stop looking for the truth, or Emma will pay the price." A cold wave of fear washed over her. Whoever was behind this knew about Emma. Her worst nightmare had come true. Her heart pounded as she quickly dialed her sister. "Olivia, Liv, I need you to take Emma for a while," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Pack her things and take her out of the city." "What?" "Sarah, what's going on?" Olivia asked, alarmed. "I can't explain right now," Sarah whispered, glancing around Alexander's dimly lit room as if the walls themselves were listening. "Please, just trust me." There was a long pause before Olivia finally answered. "Okay, but be careful." Sarah ended the call, swallowing the lump in her throat. Emma would be safe. Now, it was time to finish what she started. That night, under the cover of darkness, Sarah slipped out of the mansion and made her way to the garden. The words from Alexander's journal echoed in her mind. "The truth is in the code. Remember the garden." Moving carefully through the neatly manicured hedges, she retraced her steps from the previous night. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal plate she had found hidden in the rose bushes. 722-994-1492-4, a code. But for what? She scanned the area, looking for something, anything out of place. Then she saw it, a small, almost imperceptible indentation in the ground, partially concealed by ivy. Kneeling, she brushed away the leaves and felt a metallic surface beneath her fingertips. A hidden latch. Her breath caught as she pulled it open, revealing a set of stone steps descending into darkness. A secret passage. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The air was thick with dust and the scent of damp stone. Sarah used her phone's flashlight to illuminate the narrow tunnel, her pulse quickening with each step. At the end of the passage, she found a locked metal door. She tried the handle, it didn't budge. But then she noticed a keypad. Her mind raced. The code. With shaking fingers, she entered the numbers from the metal plate. 722-994-149214. A soft beep. Then click. The door creaked open. Sarah's breath hitched as she stepped inside. The small underground chamber was filled with files, stacks of documents, medical reports, and Sarah's stomach twisted, vials of a clear liquid. She grabbed a file labeled Morrison, Alexander, and flipped through the pages. Toxicology report. Unidentified compound detected. Effects. Induces prolonged unconsciousness while preserving brain activity. Administered. Daily via IV. Her blood ran cold. They hadn't just kept Alexander in a coma. They had put him there. Sarah turned to the shelves, scanning for more evidence, proof of who was behind this. That's when she spotted it. A contract, signed by Victoria Hayes. The moment she reached for it, a shadow fell over her. Such a shame. A voice purred behind her. Sarah spun around. Victoria stood in the doorway, flanked by two men in black suits. "You were doing so well, Miss Mitchell," Victoria said, her expression unreadable. "But you just couldn't leave well enough alone." "Could you?" Sarah backed up, clutching the files to her chest. "You did this to him. You poisoned him." Victoria sighed, as if Sarah's accusation was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Mr. Morrison was getting in the way of something much bigger than himself," she said smoothly. "He wanted to cancel a very lucrative deal. The investors weren't happy, so they found a way to silence him." Sarah clenched her fists. "You mean drug him until he couldn't fight back?" "Exactly," Victoria said, stepping closer. "And now, Miss Mitchell, I'm afraid we have a problem. You know too much." She nodded to one of the men, who stepped forward with a syringe in his hand. Sarah's stomach twisted. She knew what was in that syringe. The same drug that had kept Alexander in a vegetative state. She lunged for the exit, but the second man grabbed her, twisting her arms behind her back. "Don't fight," Victoria said, rolling up Sarah's sleeve. "It'll be easier that way." The needle pricked her skin. Sarah screamed. Then, the room erupted in chaos, the sound of shattering glass, a sharp gasp. Sarah's captor loosened his grip. Victoria staggered backward, her eyes wide, her lips parted in shock. Sarah turned her head and froze. Alexander Morrison was awake. His piercing eyes burned with fury as he ripped the IV from his arm and tried to stand. His body trembled, but his gaze locked onto Victoria with deadly precision. "You," he growled, his voice raw from months of silence. Victoria took a step back. "Alexander, you." She never got to finish. With a sudden burst of strength, Alexander lunged forward, knocking the syringe from her hand. It clattered to the floor, spilling its contents. The two men rushed to restrain him, but even in his weakened state, Alexander fought back, sending one of them crashing into the filing cabinet. Sarah wrenched herself free and grabbed the contract, the evidence that would destroy Victoria. "Let's go," she shouted at Alexander, grabbing his arm. He nodded, his breathing ragged, but his grip was strong as he pulled her toward the exit. Victoria screamed after them. "You won't get away with this." But Sarah and Alexander were already running, up the stone steps, through the garden, past the mansion gates, and into the night. For the first time in months, Alexander was free, but it wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The night air was cold against Sarah's flushed skin as she and Alexander sprinted across the mansion grounds. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. Not now. Not when Sarah was in danger. Not when everything he had lost was within reach again. Behind them, Victoria's enraged. Screams echoed through the garden. Get them. Now. The sound of footsteps thundered behind them. The guards were closing in. Sarah gasped for breath. We're not going to make it. We will. Alexander tightened his grip on her hand. Just keep running. But as they reached the gate, 2 armed guards blocked their path. Trapped. Victoria's smug voice drifted from behind them. Game over, Mr. Morrison. Slowly, Alexander turned. Even in the dim moonlight, his glare was lethal. You drugged me. You stole months of my life. His voice was low, dangerous. Victoria smirked. You were a liability. Darling, a man like you. Too much power, too many morals. We couldn't let you destroy everything we worked for. Sarah felt the rage building inside Alexander. He was weak, barely standing. But his presence filled the entire space, and Victoria knew it. Her confidence wavered. Just for a second, Alexander seized the moment. With a sudden burst of strength, he lunged. He grabbed one of the guards, twisting the gun out of his hands. Before the second guard could react, Alexander knocked him to the ground. Victoria stumbled backward. You have no idea what you're doing, she spat. Alexander aimed the gun at her. No, Victoria. You don't. Then, flashing red and blue lights flooded the estate. A loud voice boomed through the night. FBI, drop your weapons. Victoria froze. Dozens of federal agents stormed the mansion grounds, surrounding them. Sarah's knees nearly gave out in relief. They had made it. They had won. Victoria's face twisted in rage. You set me up, she whispered, her voice trembling with fury. Sarah lifted the contract, the one Victoria had signed. No, Victoria. You set yourself up. 2 agents grabbed her, yanking her hands behind her back. You can't prove anything, she shrieked. Sarah held up a flash drive, the one she had stolen from Victoria's office. Alexander smirked. We have everything. As Victoria and her team were dragged away, she locked eyes with Sarah one last time. You should have just taken the money, she hissed. Sarah didn't flinch. I have something better. Victoria scoffed. What? Love. Fairy tales don't exist. Miss Mitchell. Sarah turned to Alexander. He was watching her, like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. And for the first time in a long time, she believed in fairy tales. Hours later, Sarah sat on the couch in the mansion's private wing, her body heavy with exhaustion. She hadn't even realized she was shaking until warm hands covered hers. Alexander knelt beside her. You're safe now, he murmured. The weight of everything crashed over her at once. Tears filled her eyes. I didn't know if we were going to make it. He reached up, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. You saved me, Sarah. His voice was raw with emotion. I wouldn't have made it without you. Sarah let out a watery laugh. You literally saved my life. He smirked. Were even then. The moments stretched between them. Alexander's thumb brushed against her knuckles. Sarah's breath hitched. The way he looked at Herriot wasn't just gratitude. It was something more, and it terrified her. I should check on Emma, she whispered. Pulling away, Alexander nodded. But his eyes lingered on her, as if he wasn't ready to let go. Neither was she. The next morning, the sun streamed through the windows as a car pulled up to the estate. Sarah stood on the steps, her hands gripping the railing so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Then, the car door opened, and Emma came running. Mummy. Sarah barely had time to react before her daughter threw herself into her arms. She laughed, tears spilling down her cheeks. Oh, baby, I missed you so much. Then Emma paused. Her wide, innocent eyes landed on Alexander. For a long moment, she just stared at him. Then she ran to him. Daddy. The word hit like a thunderclap. Alexander froze. Sarah's breath caught. Emma. Sweetheart, she said gently. Alexander isn't. But before she could finish, Emma hugged him. Tightly. Like she already knew. Like she had known all along. Alexander slowly, carefully, wrapped his arms around her. His eyes met Sarah's over Emma's shoulder, and in that moment, he knew she wasn't just Sarah's daughter anymore. She was his, and they were a family. The days after Victoria's arrest were a blur of media coverage, legal proceedings, and recovery. The world now knew the truth. Alexander Morrison wasn't just a billionaire CEO who had mysteriously disappeared. He was a survivor. But instead of reclaiming his empire, Alexander did something no one expected. He walked away. 1 month later, Sarah found him in the garden, the very same garden where this entire nightmare had started. But today, it felt different, lighter, brighter. Alexander was sitting on the stone bench, watching Emma chase butterflies in the morning sun. Sarah approached carefully. "You're supposed to be resting," she teased. Alexander smiled, but there was something different in his eyes, a kind of peace she hadn't seen before. "I feel better when I'm here," he admitted. "When I'm with you, with both of you." Sarah sat beside him, pulling her knees to her chest. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of blooming roses. "You've been avoiding the press," she said carefully. Alexander let out a small chuckle. "Let's just say I've had enough of the spotlight for a lifetime." She tilted her head. "So what's next?" He turned to face her, and for the first time since waking up, he looked completely sure of himself. "I'm not going back." Sarah's eyes widened. "What?" "I'm stepping down as CEO." His voice was steady. "The company will survive without me, but if I go back, I'll just lose myself again." She stared at him, stunned. "But what will you do?" He exhaled, looking back at Emma, who was now trying to build a flower crown with way too many dandelions. "I want to help people." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "I've seen what power does to people, what greed can turn them into." He turned back to her. "But I've also seen you, the way you fought for me, the way you fought for Emma, the way you never gave up, even when it would have been easier to walk away." Sarah swallowed hard. "I want to create something that actually matters. A foundation to help single parents get back on their feet, housing, education, childcare support." He paused, then he reached for her hand. "And I want you to help me run it." Sarah's breath caught. "Me?" Alexander nodded. "You understand what it's like. You know what they need." And his voice softened. "I can't imagine doing this without you." That evening, after dinner, they sat on the couch, watching Emma color at the coffee table. She was completely focused, tongue poking out slightly as she carefully shaded in a butterfly. "Mommy," she said suddenly. Sarah looked up. "Yes, sweetheart." Emma frowned thoughtfully. "Now that Uncle Alex isn't sick anymore, does that mean we can all stay together?" Sarah and Alexander both froze. Emma looked between them, her innocent eyes filled with pure, unwavering hope. "Can we be a family forever?" Alexander's breath hitched. Sarah felt her throat tighten, but before she could answer, Alexander moved, slowly, deliberately. He got up, walked to his desk, and pulled something from the top drawer. Then he knelt in front of Sarah. Sarah's heart stopped. Emma gasped, and there it was, a ring. Simple, elegant, timeless, just like them. Sarah covered her mouth, eyes filling with disbelief. "Alexander." He took her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. "I didn't plan to do this today," he admitted, smiling. But then Emma asked the question I've been too scared to ask myself. Sarah's breath shook. "So now I have to know," Alexander continued. His voice was soft, but steady. "Sarah Mitchell, will you marry me?" Emma let out an excited squeal. Sarah laughed through her tears. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Alexander's eyes burned with certainty. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She inhaled sharply, then nodded. "Yes." And the moment she said it, Emma threw herself between them, hugging them both at the same time. "Yay, we're a family now." Alexander chuckled, wrapping an arm around both of them. Sarah buried her face in his shoulder, and for the first time in years, she felt completely, undeniably safe. 6 months later, the garden was decorated with soft golden lights, casting a warm glow over the evening sky. Rows of white chairs lined the stone path, leading to a beautiful floral arch. Friends and family gathered, whispering excitedly as music began to play. At the end of the aisle, Alexander stood in a dark navy suit, hands clasped, eyes locked on one thing: Sarah. She walked slowly, wearing a dress as simple and breathtaking as she was. Emma walked beside her, proudly tossing flower petals in every direction. The moment Sarah reached him, Alexander took her hands. His eyes were shining. "Hi," she whispered. He smiled. "Hi." The officiant began, but Sarah barely heard a word. All she knew was this: they had been through hell and back, through fear, through uncertainty, through silence. But in the end, they had found each other, and that was all that mattered. As they exchanged vows, as their guests cheered, as Emma giggled in delight, Sarah knew this was home. Alexander leaned in, his forehead pressing gently against hers. "No more secrets," he murmured. She smiled. "No more silence." And when he kissed her, the entire world disappeared. Just love, just family, and a future they would build together. As they exchanged vows, as the guests cheered, as Emma giggled with delight, Sarah knew this was home. Alexander leaned in, his forehead brushing hers. "No more secrets," he whispered. She smiled. "No more silence." And as he kissed her, the world fell away. There was only love. There was only family, and a future they would build together. Life often presents us with challenges that seem insurmountable. Sarah never imagined that her desperate search for a job would lead her to love, security, and a future she never thought possible. This story is more than just a romance. It's a reminder of how resilience, kindness, and courage can change everything. Life often presents us with challenges that seem insurmountable. Sarah never imagined that her desperate search for work would lead her to love, security, and a future she never thought possible. This story is more than just a romance. It's a reminder of how resilience, kindness, and courage can change everything. Life's darkest moments can lead to unexpected light. Sarah thought this job was just a way to survive, but it became her greatest turning point. She fought for the truth, protected the people she loved, and discovered that true wealth isn't in money, it's in connection, trust, and love. Persistence shapes our destiny. Sarah has been underestimated, dismissed, and even threatened, but she never gave up. She believed in something bigger than herself, and that belief ultimately changed not only her life, but Alexander's. Love isn't about perfection, it's about choosing each other every day. Alexander had it all except true happiness. In the end, it wasn't luck that made him rich. It was finding someone who saw him for who he was. This is true for all of us. How many times have we accepted something because we thought it was our only option? What if, instead of seeing obstacles as dead ends, we saw them as redirections to something bigger? Lesson 1. Always listen to your intuition. Sarah sensed something was wrong, and she was right. In our own lives, we often ignore warning signs or intuition. Trust yourself. Lesson 2. True wealth is not about money, but about people. Alexander thought that success meant power, but in the end, the most valuable thing in his life was love. No matter how much money we make, if we don't have sincere relationships, we are still empty. Lesson 3. You are stronger than you think. Sarah was just a struggling single mother, but she changed everything. We often underestimate our power. No matter where you are, you have the power to change your future. So, what can you learn from this story? Have you ever faced a situation where you had to fight for the truth? If this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Soulful Stories 86 for more heartwarming, life-changing stories. Because sometimes, just one decision can change your entire future. Statement. The truth in this story lies in our ability to empathize with each other. Although inspired by real emotions and struggles, this story has been adapted into a dramatic narrative. The names, characters, places, and events in this story are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or real-life events is purely coincidental. At Soulful Stories 86, we share stories that touch the heart, inspire reflection, and celebrate the power of the human spirit. Thank you for being a part of our journey.